Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our friend Dana Trent. Dana is a speaker, professor, award-winning author, and minister. A graduate of Duke Divinity School, she teaches world religions and critical thinking at Wake Technical Community College in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dana is the author of several books, including Saffron Cross, The Unlikely Story of How a Christian Minister Married a Hindu Monk, One Breath at a Time, A Skeptic's Guide to Christian Meditation, and Dessert First, Preparing for Death While Savoring Life. Her new book is Between Two Trailers, a memoir from Convergent Books. Dana is energetic and sought-after speaker, teaching at national and regional conferences, businesses, civic organizations, universities, and faith communities. And Dana spoke at several of our writers' conferences that we had produced in the past. And you can learn more about Dana at jdanatrent.com. So Dana, it's so great to see you again. Congratulations on everything, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Brian. It's great to be here with you.
So before we get into everything, is there anything else that you'd like people to know about you than what I kind of touched on there?
Oh, that's perfect. Yes, just that I'm so excited for this conversation.
Yeah, same here, same here. One thing your book talks about, and we were just talking about, is that you're from Dana, Indiana,
Mhm.
right? So
Right, that's right.
so,
Yes, birthplace of Ernie Pyle, World War
yes.
II correspondent. Yeah, right there at the Illinois border. And you're from Illinois and have lived in Indianapolis, so you're familiar with this region of Indiana and the folks who live there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So before we get into the new book, let's talk a little bit about your publishing journey because you've published books on a variety of topics,
Mhm.
which, is good news and bad news, right? In terms of marketing focus, at least,
Right.
how did that kind of happen?
Mm. My books are always the lesson plan I need in the moment that I need it. And so I'm a teacher at heart. I love making lesson plans. And so each one of my spiritual books has been the recipe, the student learning outcomes that I needed at the time, the homework that I needed in order to deal with whatever I was coping with in the moment. And so my previous books have been about spiritual practices because in those moments, what I found helpful coping with chronic illness, coping with grief and loss, coping with burnout were spiritual practices. So my first four books have been more prescriptive books about how to help people make a plan for their lives if they are experiencing any of those three huge categories, chronic health conditions, burnout, and grief and loss.
Wow. Well, it's been great to see you weave those together, and kind of cross different topics, important topics all, but, not just focused on one, particular need, one particular area.
Right.
And this memoir, as I mentioned, Between Two Trailers, from Convergent Books, this is an incredible book. And it's an incredible story, which, I didn't even know about your background, this level of detail, certainly when I first met you. Um, but how did the book itself come about?
Mm. Well, you didn't know it because I hid this part of myself for decades, Brian, and it really wasn't until both of my parents had passed away by the time I was 36 that I really began wrestling with this, and I'm 43 now. And so the book has been a nice, slow process of processing childhood trauma, of growing up in this region of Dana, Indiana, and coping with my parents' mental health challenges, their substance misuse, our deep, deep poverty growing up in this region that is mostly comprised of food deserts. They are out there in Western Indiana. And so the book came out of necessity, much like the other books, of learning how to cope with a crisis. And for me, the crisis was how do I navigate the world and this past that no one knows about this, my past childhood when my parents are not here. And so that's how the book began, sort of little bits and pieces of it. And you and I were even at a writing workshop in 2018. And that was a year after my mother died. And I was just starting to examine the seeds of what ultimately became this book, Between Two Trailers.
Wow. Wow.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, honestly, it reminds me so much of Frederick Buechner's situation.
Oh,
right?
yes.
Where, he couldn't write about his father's suicide and his family's kind of aftermath of that for many, many years
Mhm.
afterwards. I mean, did you draw any parallels when you're thinking about the
100%.
difficulty of writing your family history?
Yes, because suicide has its own particular set of stigma,
Yeah.
but mental health in families is certainly still stigmatized. Childhood trauma is still stigmatized. I mean, we're on this huge, fortunately, crossroads, this journey of lifting the stigma on these topics. And I think it's because we are, at least I'm teaching a generation and we are interacting with a new generation, Gen Z, that is wanting to have these conversations because they're anxious and they're depressed. And in many cases, they are traumatized and they are coming forward, not in a way that I could have done, 3 decades ago and saying, we need help, we need coping mechanisms. And so you're right. It does have parallels to let's talk about something that was not possible to talk about when, in my case, my parents were living, and in Beekner's case too.
Yeah, and that's,
Mhm.
part of the similarity that I
Right.
received.
Yeah.
And you're not, it's not like the two of you are alone in that regard, but I mean, I
No.
totally get it.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I'd
Mhm.
like to read this quote from Tina Constable, the EVP and publisher of Convergent. She says, in my 30 years of publishing, rarely have I seen a proposal as promising as this. Out of the dozens of memoir proposals we read each year, Dana's proposal stood out to the entire team for its exceptional writing, compelling storytelling, and riveting family history.
Mhm.
So that is quite a compliment.
Oh, yes. The best. The best. When I read that, I couldn't believe it. I mean, gosh, you can't ask for anything more than that, than the publisher to have such lovely words about your work. It's incredible.
Yeah, that was really great to hear. I
Mhm.
mean, Tina wouldn't say that about just anybody, or any book.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we also have to talk about our good friend Barbara Brown Taylor,
Yes.
who wrote the foreword
Mhm.
to this book, which was, an absolutely wonderful thing. Um,
Mhm.
in it, she writes, wounds and blessings come in matched pairs, at least if we're willing to wrestle them to the ground. That's not a promise, it's a dare. And the only way to
Mhm.
find out what happens next is to accept. So is that kind of how you feel about the book?
Yes. I didn't know it was going to be so daring to write. And I didn't know that all those wounds were going to bubble up for me in the writing process, but I absolutely have experienced the healing. And I could not have experienced it without uncovering and digging into the pain that I was feeling and that I had been hiding and holding on to for over 30 years, while my parents were living.
Wow.
Mhm.
So a few years ago, you and I worked with Barbara together at the New Writers Workshop before the Wild Goose Festival. Is that the first time you had met Barbara?
It is. It
Is
is. So
it?
it's thanks to you.
I was
Yes.
well, thanks to her,
She is,
but
oh my gosh, she's my angel. Thanks to you. You introduced us and then I helped her launch her 2019 book, Holy Envy, when she came here to Raleigh and wanted a conversation partner. And since I teach world religions, she and I sat down at Quail Ridge to launch that book into the hands of all of the folks in Raleigh.
very cool, very cool.
Mhm.
So here's Barbara's endorsement for the book. Um, if Dana Trent's books were truthful, that would be enough. If they were elegantly written, that would be even better. If they spoke straight to the hearts of her readers, that would make her a writer worth reading. In fact, they are all of these things, encompassing what it means to be human on this earth, making reality more bearable because it is so clearly a reality we share. Between Two Trailers reminds me of that again. So those are just wonderful compliments
Ah,
from Barbara,
yes.
especially a person like Barbara.
Oh, I know. I know. I'm pinching myself. I can't believe that, folks are saying these things about the book and the book is getting ready to be birthed into the world. It's really pinch me moments, many of which started back then at that conference where you hosted us in the summer of 2018.
It's crazy how things come around, isn't it? I
It
mean,
is. It
the
is.
relationships that we establish, you just never know where they're going to end up, which is
Yeah,
a miraculous and wonderful thing.
it's true. Yeah.
I
And
like to be,
that's your gift. That is truly your gift, Brian. It really is. I just want to make sure I
well,
say that out loud to you because it's true. It's 100% true.
well, thank you, but I've just been very blessed with, being able to work with people like you and Barbara. I mean, it's just like, it doesn't get any better. So, um, and I'd like to read one more endorsement. This one's from another good friend, Phil Gully, who's also from Indiana. He says, I have motorcycled nearly every road in Vermilion County, having seen its best and worst, have dipped deeply into the work of its other literary giant, Ernie Pyle, and would rank this stirring memoir in the same rarefied air. So how
Mm.
about that?
Wow. I know. You can't ask for anything more than that. A little poor girl from Dana, Indiana. I mean, that's the gold right there.
So what would you like people to take away from the book?
Mm. My favorite question that I started with when I began writing the book was, how do you go home when home is hard? And the universal themes of home, even though the details of folks' stories are different and all of our childhoods are different, when you walk into a room, Brian, when you and I walk into any room, everyone in that room has an experience of home. And for many of us, there are aspects of home that is hard. And so if we are looking for home and home is hard, how do we find home back in the places where we've been running from? And how do we confront the past without losing ourselves? And so those to me are the truest and key takeaways. If I'm writing a lesson plan for readers of this book, that is what I hope that they will see in its pages and encourage they will be encouraged to ask themselves these hard questions because I do think there is a value of homecoming, even when we take our baggage with us, right? And there is a power of looking to heal from relationships and people who are no longer with us. And so, a lot of us move away from home in order to escape or become better people or find jobs. But I think it's important, especially in a general election year, to think about how do we maintain and reconcile relationships that may be strained because of complicated ideas of home or complicated families. Because when we do that, we can find more happiness in our own lives and we can learn how to cope in healthy ways from past hurts when home was hard.
So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about finding your next calling.
Mm.
You wear several different hats, including teaching and writing books. How did you choose these areas of
Mm.
vocation?
Mm. Well, I was trained at Duke Divinity School as a minister. I became a chaplain after my MDiv. I was a chaplain resident for 1 year, and I was just completely burned out. I worked primarily with dying patients and their families, and that is the basis for Dessert First, my book on grief and loss. And so I knew that I didn't want to be a chaplain. I knew that I was not going to be a pastor because I'm Baptist. I'm ordained Southern Baptist. And so my gender identity is an occupational hazard when it comes to Baptist preaching. And so I was really struggling, Brian. Like I was working at a desk job at Duke University. I was doing some secretary work and then some grant writing and development fundraising work. But I was just so unhappy until I finally realized that my passion when I was a little girl was taking my parents' National Geographics in our dark trailer living room and distributing them on the floor and bossing, we should say, imaginary students to use their textbook, which was their National Geographic magazine, to do homework. And I would teach from an invisible blackboard, teaching them out of the National Geographic magazines. And
Wow.
right? And so I knew that I wasn't made for a desk job. I knew I wasn't made for a pulpit, every Sunday. And I realized that my calling was teaching. And so the beautiful thing about teaching is that writing works perfectly in tandem with teaching. It's the perfect balance of extroversion and introversion. And so, yeah, so I became a classroom teacher working with community college students. And then writing goes perfectly with that. I could get up early in the mornings and write. I can write in the evenings. I can write on the weekends. Because I do think as writers, it's important for us to have sort of a what is called a bread job, right? So something that keeps us grounded in the reality of the world and also keeps us observing people and stories. And so that's sort of where I landed in terms of writing and teaching.
Wow. Wow. So let's talk about discernment.
Mm.
You've been around the block a few times now, and have you reflected much on the processes that you use to make decisions? What paths to take, what choices to make?
Mhm. Spiritual practice. Those first four books, that were coping mechanisms for dealing with crises, I still use all of those
Hmm.
spiritual practices in discernment. Journaling is one of my favorite practices, as is prayer and meditation. And Brian, I'm up every morning about an hour just before dawn. I always make sure I get up in the dark before dawn to do that discernment time. And one doesn't need to be religious or Christian in order to have that sort of quiet time of discernment. But for me, that is how I tune in to myself. And then in my tradition of Christianity, that is how I tune into the triune God to discern what my calling is, to discern my vocation, to discern next steps, next books I need to write, people I need to care for in my life, what my next goal for teaching is, whatever it might be. That quiet time, 1 hour every morning, is my discernment time in my chair in the dark. Some days are filled with tears. Some days are filled with laughter. Right. But I have to have that discernment time each morning. And it's what I call sort of also my self-care scaffolding of making sure that I'm set for the day. And I've oriented my day to God and to spiritual practices, because when I do that, the rest of the day falls into place.
Wow. Well, good for you for establishing that discipline.
Mm. Oh, it's
Seems like it's incredibly
necessary.
important for you.
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah.
I wish I was
Mhm.
such a morning person that I could do something like that, but that's not my DNA.
No, and I think for a lot of people it's not. And so that's, when it comes to discernment, if it's 5 minutes in the car before you are picking your kid up from carpool, right? I mean, that's quiet time. That's discernment time. I mean, my philosophy is whatever works for folks, and nothing has to be rigid and no routine is permanent, really.
Hmm. Hmm. So, as you know, I kind of consider authors as, single person entrepreneurs. I mean,
Yeah.
whether they like it or not, or whether they view themselves that way or not. What advice do you have for people who are just kind of getting started on that road?
Yes. Keep a day job for sure. For sure. I think it's good for our mental health to have a steady Eddie paycheck job, whether it's an hourly job or a salary job. Any job is a good job, right? But there is something about the mental freedom of knowing that you have a paycheck coming in from this compartment of your life that will free you up to do your writing and do your practice so that it doesn't have to become an emergency situation where you're putting so much pressure on yourself to make money from writing that it causes anxiety and depression and maybe some mental health challenges or some physical health challenges. So I always, when folks come to me about writing advice, I always say, make sure you have that bread job. It really is more important than you think it is. And here's the bonus, Brian. It keeps you observing. It keeps you interacting with people and noticing the world around you. Because at the end of the day, that is a writer's job. That is our primary vocation as writers, is watching the world around us and making meaning out of what we are observing.
That sounds very Beekner-esque. Pay attention, as he would say.
Pay attention. Yes.
Exactly. But I think
Mhm.
that's such great advice, for
Mhm.
new authors. Because so many people will have a tendency to say, well, I want to, get to a position where I don't have to do anything besides write books. That's what I really want to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Nice
Yeah.
gig if you can do it, but I mean, that's not practical for most people. It's not the real world.
No, and and then it puts pressure on the publishing situation, which you and I know, publishing, I mean, just think about the pandemic, right? Publishing is such an up and down industry, and there are so many variables and factors that, you certainly don't want to over rely on a book launching because anything could happen, during that launch, during that publication.
Well, to that point, I mean, many authors, supplement their royalty income with their speaking income.
Right.
And that went away, largely speaking, during the pandemic as well. So, it was a double
Yes.
hit for several people.
That's right. That's a very good point. Yeah, and we're just now sort of starting to see, the cracks break open to get back to speaking. Yeah.
So I know you're in the middle of a book launch, which is wonderful, but I have to ask you kind of about the future. Are you thinking
No.
much about whether it's books or other projects or, where you're headed next?
This is very unusual for me, but for the first time, I think in 43 years of my life, I am very content to be present in the moment. Oh, and I never thought I would say that because, Brian, much like you, I'm always looking to the next project. I'm
Yeah.
always like, what do I need to do? My goal is out here, reach, reach, reach. But I am so content just to be in the moment with this book and to see day by day as it comes and to hear from readers. I am not even thinking one bit about the future because I'm so at peace. And that's part goes full circle back to that discernment part of it too. Mhm.
Well, good for you. I mean, I know it will come at some
Yeah.
point
Oh,
when it's
yeah.
ready, whatever it is. But
Yes. Give me a
that's
week and I'll be itching for the next project.
well, keep us posted, okay?
Yes, absolutely. Mhm.
Well, Dana, I'm so happy for you about this book. I really think this is going to do well.
Thank you.
And best wishes with it. Again, the title for folks is Between Two Trailers, a memoir. It's from Convergent Books, which is a division of Penguin Random House. And go to Dana's website, jdanatrent.com. Dana, again, congratulations, and thanks so much for all you do.
Thanks so much, Brian, for having me. Enjoy talking with you.